It's been a hot minute since we talked about the Hudson's Bay Company. When we last left off in my corporatocracy video from what seems like ages ago, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company had squared up at the Battle of Seven Oaks. The Nor'westers came out on the winning side, but there was more to it than that. Not only was this the catalyst to end the fur trade corporate wars, it was the birth of a new nation. One born out of a mixture of old First Nations bloodlines and new European ones. The Métis peoples of Assiniboia would be the wedge holding back Canada, and to a lesser extent the United States, from exploiting the vast riches of the North American West. Let's dive into the growth of the Métis nation of Assiniboia and their conquests. The victory of the Métis Nor'westers under Cuthbert Grant seemed to change the feeling around the Red River colony. Before, they would typically identify as hunters, trappers, and traders, but now they added soldiers to that list. Grant had proved that they could provide competent local officers, and that there were no Europeans on the continent that could match a drilled Métis rifleman at shooting. While Grant's career would continue with very little fanfare and eventually fizzle out, the other soldiers would be emboldened and expand their influence south. This would bring them in direct and bloody conflict with the Council of the Seven Fires. But before we get into that, let's lay out who the Council of the Seven Fires were and who the Métis were. The Métis are considered one of the three major indigenous nations of Canada. The name Métis means of mixed race, giving away that they are descendants of the first European trappers and explorers who would adopt the local way of life and also marry into First Nations families. Slowly, over centuries, a unique language developed called MICHIF, which is a mixture of Cree with English and French loanwords added in. The Métis proved vital to trade across North America. They worked the land and built towns up from out of the clay to create the last bastion of urbanization before the harsh plains of the West. Their iconic sash jimischif, capote, and mixture of indigenous and European clothing made them stand out from other people on the continent. The famous Red River cart was the all-terrain vehicle of its day, being able to carry a ton and still ford a river. Métis fiddle music and dancing is lively and considered historically significant to the development of the Canadian arts. But it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine. As with anyone who wasn't English and Protestant, the Christian Métis were discriminated against and their needs were ignored. Thankfully, for most of the 19th century, they had the distance from Lower Canada and an apathetic HBC to guard their way of life. As long as the furs and trade kept going through the colony, there would be no issues. The Council of the Seven Fires, or Ocheti Shakowin, was a political and military alliance of the Dakota and Lakota people that stretched across present-day Wisconsin, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The Seven Fires Council would at one point occupy the area around the Great Lakes, but be pushed westward by the Council of the Three Fires, who were themselves displaced by the Iroquois Confederacy. The Three Fires would come into conflict with the Dakota for much of the 18th century, culminating in the Battle of St. Croix Falls in Wisconsin. The Seven Fires troops fought a long, hard battle, but eventually were routed and resigned themselves to settle on the Western Plains. By 1851, they had signed numerous treaties with the American government, none of which were completely upheld. With the treaties not working, the Dakota and Lakota starving thanks to the decline of the buffalo, and the American settlers flooding in from the east, and now the Métis pushing their borders south, they would try to stop them the only way they knew how, with guns and violence. The Métis and the Seven Fires had tussled before. The Red River Colony plot extended south of the 49th parallel, which was considered Seven Fires' hunting ground. Any Métis buffalo hunter would tell you when the Red River carts were trading south of Pembina, you had to keep your eyes open for any kind of attack. The Métis had developed an almost foolproof way of warding off any attacks: trench warfare. Well, almost trench warfare. Essentially, they would circle the carts, keeping the livestock in the center, then dig a trench under the carts to store supplies and shelter women and children. In front of the carts, they would dig rifle pits and earthworks to gain a cover advantage on the open plains. And it was this ingenuity that all of their enemies found impossible to overcome. The mostly dragoon style of war that the Seven Fires soldiers were used to had almost no way to penetrate the defenses of the Métis. However, that wouldn't stop them from trying one last grand battle that, from a Seven Fires perspective, seemed like an easy win. June 12, 1851. Two parties of Assiniboian buffalo hunters and traders were heading to the hunting spot between Dog Den Butte and Coteau de Missouri, or as it was known at the time, Grand Coteau. For the sake of clarity, the two parties will be named after the priests they brought along with them. One brought Father Albert Lacombe, and the other brought Reverend Louis-Francois Richer Lefleche. This was deep in Seven Fires territory, so they knew they were going to come into some resistance, and almost immediately, they realized they might have driven too deep. When Le Fleche's party had reached its campsite at Grand Coteau, the party leader, Jean-Baptiste Falcon, cousin to the famed Métis General Cuthbert Grant, ordered a scout to recce the surrounding buttes. The scout returned with dreadful news. They had spotted a large camp of Seven Fire locals, roughly numbering around 2,000 to 2,500 soldiers. And even worse, they were in striking distance. Falcon immediately ordered the roughly 67 hunters, their wives, mothers, and children to dig in and prepare for war. A day later, July 13th, Lacombe's party was nowhere to be seen. They had been dealing with their own probing attacks from Seven Fires scouts and had been held up. Falcon and Le Fleche were all alone and outnumbered roughly 30-1. 5 men rode out to parley with the Seven Fires camp and were greeted by 21 soldiers on horseback. They were surrounded and then escorted into the camp, but something smelled off. 2 of the 5 Métis riders broke off and suddenly raced back to the camp under heavy fire from the Seven Fires riflemen. The other 3 Métis were predictably held as prisoners of war. The 2 scouts returned to camp and immediately sprung into action. Anyone who could hold a gun, 12 years and up, was called into the trench. Bolstered by their child soldiers, it was now 77 riflemen against close to 2,000 mounted dragoons from the Seven Fires Council. 2 Seven Fires riders approached the camp. They had no intention to make war, and the captives would be freed tomorrow for a small price. So if the Métis could lay down their arms and relax, that would be in the best interest of everyone. Falcon didn't trust this obvious ruse, and kept tabs on the camp as best as he could. The Seven Fires soldiers were now watching the small Métis camp at all hours. The next morning, after a full church service at the Métis camp, nearly all 2,000 of the Seven Fires horsemen appeared on the outskirts of Le Fleche's camp, with the 3 prisoners in tow. Once again, they parleyed. 30 Métis approached the warband and asked them to stay well away. No promises of a peaceful resolution was given, and the instant the 30 Métis started to ride back to the cart circle, the Seven Fire warriors charged. The 30 men, plus one of the prisoners, managed to get back to their rifle pits just in time to fire on the advancing cavalry charge. As with cavalry charges in the Great War 60 years later, the entrenched riflemen made short work of the first charge. The Seven Fires turned their charge away and regrouped. Falcon mustered his troops, and Le Fleche, in full mass garb, assisted. With a cross in one hand and a hatchet in the other, he blessed the soldiers in the earthworks and calmed the women and children. Even when the bullets flew past him, he seemed defiant to their purpose, as if God was his armor. At one point, he purposely made himself the tallest target by standing on a cart and hosting a sermon. Before the second charge could start, the remaining 2 Métis prisoners had made a run for it. One made it to the carts without issue, taking down a pursuing warrior, but the other knew his horse couldn't outrun the Seven Fires ponies. He managed to grab a gun and fired wildly into the charging mass, supposedly taking down 3 warriors, before he was peppered with bullets, arrows, and spears. The second charge came later that day. They circled the Métis camp in a dervish style, poking at any weak spot they might see. The trenches seemed to do the trick, as the Métis recorded very few casualties, other than the 4 oxen and 12 horses that were held in the cart circle. The Seven Fires' second charge also petered out quickly. They collected their 8 dead soldiers and many wounded just in time for a massive thunderstorm to turn the area into a mud pit, severely hampering any future cavalry action. 2 Métis had rode out to find Lacombe's party and see what was holding them up. The nearly 300 people would be added to the 77 Métis holding off the cavalry charges. So if 80 Métis could hold off nearly 2,000 riders, what would another 300 be able to do? The next day, the warriors of the Seven Fires Council kept the pressure on, but the Métis had an escape plan. They would push their cart line forward and try to outflank the enemy. To do this, they sent a distracting party to take the bulk of the Seven Fires warriors off the main camp, and then wheeled the carts forward, surrounding the enemy camp and hoping to dislodge them. This turned out to be a masterstroke, and the Métis advanced, firing relentlessly from all angles at the now exposed Seven Fire camp. They mustered another charge, which was again repelled by the Métis riflemen. A second thunderstorm was quickly approaching, and now surrounded, the Seven Fires cavalry couldn't keep up the fight. They gave the signal for quarter, packed their things, and rode off. The Métis had won the day. Their losses totaled 12 horses, 4 oxen, 1 man and 3 wounded. To the Seven Fires, 80 men lost, numerous wounded, and 65 horses killed. From that point forward, the Seven Fires Council would avoid any Métis columns that would cross into their borders. Just as the Three Fires Council before them and the Iroquois before them, the Métis had shown their might and pushed the Seven Fires Council west. They would come into conflict with the American government next, first losing the Dakota War of 1862, one of the bloodiest conflicts seen on the prairies at the time, to only top it 15 years later during the Black Hills War of 1876, where they decisively defeated Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, but would ultimately lose to American forces. The Wounded Knee Massacre during the Ghost Dance War of 1890 would end any resistance from the Council of the Seven Fires until the 1970s. Then, once again at Wounded Knee, the American Indian Movement, or AIM for short, occupied the town for 71 days and sparked a drive to establish the Republic of Lakota. If recognized, it would be the first modern-day First Nations country in history. They still sit on their ancestral land and have one of the largest reservations on the continent. They also hold the US government to task about their operations around the Black Hills. The Métis would go on to enforce their sovereignty from not only the Seven Fires, but also the Canadian government. During the sale of Rupert's Land in 1870, they would lash out and create a new Republic of Assiniboia. But that is a story for another time. Thanks for watching.